and a board member of both the Capital Times Company and the EVU Foundation, the newspaper's charitable arm. He received a bachelor's degree in journalism from Drake University in Des Moines and a master's degree in communications from the American University in Washington, D.C. Paul was previously a reporter and an editor at the Wisconsin State Journal and later vice president of operations for Madison Newspapers, Inc., and before joining the Capital Times in 2006. Today, Paul will talk about the future of newspapers in Wisconsin and specifically in Madison. And we look forward to your presentation, Paul, and we've made a contribution to the Rotary International Polio Plus Fund as a way to say thanks for speaking with us today. I also want to mention that we'll have time for a Q&A with our speaker at the end as it allows, but please wait for the microphone if you've got a question. So let's welcome Paul Fanlund to our podium. Welcome, Paul.
Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. I am gratified to see all the familiar faces, Capital Times colleagues from the past, State Journal colleagues from the past, and many longtime friends. It's just a delight to be here. The last time I spoke to this club was in 2017, which was the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Capital Times. William T. Evu opened the Capital Times a few blocks across the square in a storefront on King Street in that year. And we had a lot of fun celebrating that then. The first time I was ever in this room for Rotary was more like 40 years ago, and I was sitting in a chair over by the door as a newly arrived reporter to town, and I think I covered a speech by Bob Kastenmeier, who many of you will remember as our congressman, and what struck me at the time was there were no women in the room. It was all male at that point, and just a reminder of how far the club's come in those intervening years. As advertised, my topic today is the outlook for newspapers in Madison and in Wisconsin. I'm going to share the thoughts I'm going to share the thoughts of both the State Journal and Capital Times editors as they look forward, as well as the thoughts of our top executive for Madison Media Partners, which is what we're doing our business as these days, the old Madison newspapers, and also tap into the thoughts of the head of the Wisconsin Newspaper Association. So frankly, when I took this invitation and thought about it, I really wanted to get to the next generation of thinkers and bring them here today, and it's great to have them here with me. I hope you can say hello to them. They are a really impressive group of folks. So I'm going to start with that, and I'm going to wrap up with my thoughts after I share their thoughts. And I want to start by telling you, and Paul already got to this some, that I'm kind of a unicorn in Madison newspaper history. That's because I've worked in the same building on Fish Hatchery Road for more than 40 years. But during that time, I've actually worked for 3 companies, and I don't think anybody else has done that. 20 years, as Paul mentioned, as a State Journal reporter and editor, 5 or 6 years as vice president of operations for Madison newspapers, and the past 16 or 17 as a now publisher of the Capital Times. And I think it's worth just pausing to make sure the audience understands the distinction between those companies. First, the State Journal was founded in 1839. It was called the Madison Express. The name's changed a couple of times since. It's owned by Lee Enterprises Incorporated, a publicly traded company in Davenport, Iowa, and is now active in 77 markets. When I was working in the State Journal, which this sounds bad, but it was in the last century, in the 70s through the 90s. Madison was the flagship for Lee, the biggest newspaper in Lee. But Lee subsequently acquired Berkshire Hathaway's newspapers and also Hearst publications, Hearst newspapers. So now it has properties like St. Louis and Buffalo, and also has newspapers in Racine, Kenosha, and La Crosse. That's in sharp contrast to the Capital Times, who many of you know is locally owned, privately held, and not publicly traded, and has that public mission that dates to 1917, when we were founded, when Mr. Evu created the journalistic and philanthropic mission that continues to endure today. The 2 newsrooms have been separate all this time throughout, but in 1948 made an agreement to create Madison newspapers to share all business functions and profits, not incidentally, under what was called Madison Newspapers then became known as Capital Newspapers, and today as Madison Media Partners. So to be clear, I haven't even gotten to my first slide. Okay, this was supposed to be up for a while. So to be clear, sorry, Jane, the Capital Times and Wisconsin State Journal, Capital Times Company and Lee each own half of Madison Media Partners, not the other way around. As I thought about what I wanted to speak about today, I thought, you know what, if I had a button on me, you could push it and I could give you one of three speeches that I've been giving for 10 or 15 years. One is about the awesomeness of William T. Evu, and I've talked about that a lot, and he was awesome, but you've heard that probably if you've ever heard me speak. The other two themes that I talked about quite a bit is trust in media, that mainstream media has now become a pejorative term, it seems to me, and it wasn't even a thing. We didn't even call ourselves the mainstream media in the first 20, 25 years of my career, and so trust in media is another theme. The third theme is what economic changes have wrought to the industry with the advent of the internet and Craigslist savaging the classified advertising model and so forth. But I'm not going to talk about those today. I'm going to look forward. I'm going to start by talking about Madison and the State Journal and Cap Times. Both of them have editors, new editors in the past year who are with us today. Both of those editors are Wisconsin natives. Both worked as senior editors in Gannett newspapers, overseeing investigative efforts in other markets. Let me first introduce Kelly Lecker, who's been here about a year. She came from Columbus, Ohio, and she's editor of the Wisconsin State Journal. You want to wave, Kelly, so people can see you? You know, they're going to take this away from me. Okay. The second editor is Mark Trinan, who's the new editor of the Capital Times. Mark has only been here since the first of the year. Mark joined me. He had been the top editor at the Green Bay Press Gazette, and he, like I said, joined a couple of months ago. Mark, you want to just wave to the crowd so they know who you are? So, to get started here, I asked the two editors to give me some bullet points on what they're thinking journalistically, what their priorities are, and I prepared a slide, and we'll touch on those next. So in the State Journal, Kelly wants to point out that they don't see themselves, the State Journal doesn't see itself as competing with television, that it sees itself really focusing on the how and why of stories, that they cover breaking news, but their first priority is what we call in-depth explainers in the business. She cares, and the State Journal cares about digital, print and digital, but would like to point out that the digital allows them to use video and audio and other techniques that aren't available in print. They meet every day and talk about what stories they're going to cover in that day, and then decide how to apply the best format to those. Kelly points out that print newspapers are certainly different than they were 10 years ago and will be different 10 years from now, but she thinks they will still be around and play a role at that point. She thinks it's crucial that the State Journal reflect the community, particularly in the diversity of its staff and finding effective ways to get community input. Her goal is to highlight people doing great things and also to find community obstacles and report on them and shed light on them. The State Journal continues to be very involved in this community, and I wanted to share these because the club is so civically engaged. Through the Empty Stocking Club, which was championed by my first publisher, Martin Woolman. Some of you may remember Murph Woolman. He's been gone a while now. They do the Spelling Bee, Helping Hands, and the Teacher Support Network. So that's kind of an outline of what Kelly's thinking about. Shifting over to Mark and the Capital Times, Our goal as we move into the new year is to sharpen our journalism on topics and issues that are of greatest interest, we think, in Madison, whether that's zoning or bus rapid transit or the achievement gap or other sorts of local issues. And we continue to use the tagline, the Capital Times as Madison as it gets. We think it still fits. Our goal is to make readers more knowledgeable about the community, feel engaged through both our daily digital reports and our weekly tabloid. We strive to increase the level of accountability journalism we provide, and we're planning on doing more investigative journalism going forward. We want to be prolific in the watchdog role as perhaps we've been with arts, culture, and the restaurant scenes in recent years. Obviously, fairness and ethical approaches and getting at the truth is paramount with us, and we are a digital-first news organization. We've been increasingly using social media to try to reach new audiences that aren't print-centric. And I would just point out again, we have the robust Wednesday print edition. I'm going to add on my own slide here a couple points I'd just like to make about the Capital Times. This is kind of an illustration of what we're doing these days. It's kind of cool. So the UW Journalism School got a grant from the National Science Foundation for several $millions, and they're creating a tool to try to assess, measure disinformation and misinformation across social media in Wisconsin. And part of that grant is going to fund a reporter for the Capital Times who will independently write whatever we choose to write about that effort. So that's just kind of an interesting innovation. There are lots of innovations like that in journalism. I just point out that one as one example. The two other pillars of the Capital Times, as many of you know, are our progressive opinion, which was very important to EVU, and everybody in the room knows the Capital Times has plenty of progressive opinions if you pay much attention to us. And our charitable arm, the EVU Foundation, which has given more than $70 million back to the community since Mr. EVU's death, and we're giving money away at a rate of about $2 million a year. There's also a much smaller fund called the Cap Times Kids Fund that Mr. EVU created because he didn't have children. He and his wife Zilla did not have children of their own, but he was extremely interested in the welfare of children. And there may be a board member or two of the Kids Fund in here today. Also wanted to mention that in the last 2 or 3 years we've had a robust membership program. It's a voluntary membership program for the Capital Times. It's really grown. It helps us a lot, and also is an opportunity to be more engaged with us through our events and in other forums. And if you're interested in that, I'd urge you to go to captimes.com to look for that. So I'm going to switch over now and talk about the business realities of newspapering. But before I do, I just wanted to say again that in the hands of Kelly and Mark, I really feel good about the journalism and the talent that's being brought as a veteran journalist. So that's great. So let me turn to the business side of journalism. I'm not going to stand up here and try to mislead you and say we're as big a business as we were when I was a young reporter, editor in the State Journal, or even 20 years ago when I was a vice president for Madison newspapers. But I think it's important that I mention we remain profitable and we still have healthy profit margins. Which brings me to another of my guests here today, Ross McDuffie. Ross, you want to stand up? So that's where Ross's leadership comes in. Ross is the president of Madison Media Partners and is the top executive for the lease side of the ownership in Madison and responsible for all revenue. Ross joined us 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, from McClatchy Newspapers in Georgia, and is still in the process of learning to love our winters. So some business points, and I think these are important for this kind of audience. Wanted to point out that all legacy media companies have seen some areas of decline, whether that's newspapers, radio, television, or whatever. The one area of growth is digital for everyone, and that's because audiences are gravitating to digital, and advertisers who want to reach those audiences are also gravitating toward digital. And this point is one I really want to kind of underscore. It's and I've been talking about it with Ross and with his predecessors, now the publisher in Buffalo, New York, that we have not lost audience. We've lost print circulation, certainly, but our audience is not smaller. Our audience is bigger, but fragmented across print, websites, social media, newsletters, live events. In a given week, 81.3% of the market interacts with one of our, I guess we call them platforms these days, platforms. Another misnomer, I think, is that all of our most enthusiastic readers are boomers like me, when the actual average is 47, which may be a bit of a surprise. 4 of the $5 spent with our company come to us from local businesses, or at least locally controlled businesses. And we think that our digital product line has allowed us to replace many of the dollars from print declines. So that's the shift in what we're doing in terms of serving advertisers trying to reach a selective audience. And the last point Ross would make is that the community, you have an opportunity to influence our future by considering the newspaper, not only print ads, but also our digital capabilities. Before I leave this part, I have to just mention that Cap Times Idea Fest, as many of you are familiar with Idea Fest, we've done it 6 times. This fall will be the 7th. I'm in the process of planning this fall's program with my friend David Marinus, who's a popular speaker and a friend of many of you. Last fall we had the legendary journalist Carl Bernstein and Jamie Raskin of the January 6th Committee, and about 50 or 60 other speakers. And I'm doing a little bit of a promotion for Idea Fest, but I'm also mentioning it because it's become an important part of the business model for the newspaper companies. So while it's also a great way to engage in the community, it is that as well. The newest thing we're doing is an executive breakfast series, which is a quarterly series at the Edgewater, in which we bring leading CEOs from around Wisconsin for a breakfast to talk about doing business in Wisconsin, and we've had 2 of those, and those will continue. So those events are an important part of our future. So let's pivot to the statewide situation, the outlook in statewide newspapers, and for that I'd like to introduce Beth, who's Executive Director of the Wisconsin Newspaper Association. Just stand up and make yourself seen. So the first 3 slides I have from Beth are kind of quick ones that come from a Wisconsin Newspaper Association marketing study done last year. It was an independent marketing study, but has a couple statistics I think that might surprise you a little bit. This first slide, this slide indicates that 84% of Wisconsin adults read newspapers in some form at least once a month, which, given the headlines and most of what you hear, might be a little bit of a surprise. This slide indicates that both print and digital readership is still robust across the state. Again, these are Wisconsin statistics. And this final slide, and this is a little bit of an advertising slide, I suppose. As you might expect, the Wisconsin newspaper reader is more affluent and better educated than the average citizen, and there are some metrics around that. And it's just important for us to continue to bang that drum as we take our economic model forward. She also shared some other numbers with me that might or might not surprise you, that there are 28 newspapers in Wisconsin that publish at least 5 times a week, 194 newspapers in total, almost 9,000 journalists in the state. And in only one county, Menominee, in the far northeastern part of the state, has there been a debate about whether it's a news desert, a so-called news desert without news. But the WNA is disputing that based on the Menominee Nation News being published there. So I think those are rather heartening statistics, actually. And I have some other points from Beth as we talk about print newspapers. Now, obviously, younger people have not developed a big affection for ink on paper, and that's the reality, and that's what we're dealing with. But there are other pressures as well. The cost and availability of newsprint is a real issue. I remember being involved in that as a vice president, and it is a big challenge now and going forward, as is the cost of delivery. A lot of papers outstate they use the mail to deliver, and the cost of postage and the dependability of the Postal Service is not going in good directions. And it's also much more difficult to find carriers than it was when I was running the circulation department a long time ago. Harder to find people to deliver the papers. But her message here is that those who love print shouldn't despair, that she sees a future in which maybe print publications are print less frequently. They decline, they roll back their frequency. For example, they may put in print things that document births, deaths, personal, professional accomplishments, and other landmark events, while doing the news more online as a way. And the Capital Times did that a little bit. We stopped being a 6-day afternoon newspaper in 2008, print daily, and now have the Wednesday weekly, and are really digital first. So Beth makes the point, and statistics back up and research backs up, that newspapers still own the local news franchise and are most trusted regardless of what platform we're on. So that might seem like a good place to bring this in for a landing, but I'm going to bring it back to me because it's my speech, and I've been doing this the longest, and I have the microphone. So I'm going to finish with some of my summary points and then answer any questions you have. I guess the first point I'd make is it's really hard to predict the future of newspapers in print with any certainty. There's just too many variables that change not only annually but more often than that. But I think it is also worth noting, taking an optimistic tone here, that I think newspapers have been great, but digital journalism offers a bunch of advantages: immediacy, interactivity, in our parlance, an infinite news hole. When I was in the State Journal, we'd run out of space and not be able to run a lot of stories. We don't have that issue now. And obviously audio and video enhancements. I love newspapers in print as much as probably anybody in the room. The feel of the newsprint and the serendipity of being able to scan a newspaper and have that experience. As a young man, I thought my job in print-only newspapering was magical. I remember, this has been 35 years or so ago, I was the Sunday editor of the State Journal, and I remember on Saturday nights, we'd have 3 editions, and watching that page come together like a jigsaw puzzle with pieces coming together and finally finishing that page, and then about 1 a.m. Signing off on the last brief, the last short story, which is typically about some accident someplace, and then hearing those presses roar and the trucks pull up and those newspapers be circulated all over southern Wisconsin 5 or 6 hours later. And I love that and I miss it, but times change and we are in a very different era now. A couple other points I'd make that may be a little bit surprising, but I wanted to emphasize this, that newspaper readers, newspaper subscribers, during my lifetime, you've never really paid as much for the product as it costs to produce. Advertising in the good old days when we were roaringly successful, advertising would subsidize print subscribers. I've told this story before, so indulge me, but when I started graduate school in Washington, D.C., shortly after Watergate, I got the Washington Post delivered to my apartment door, 7 days a week for $5 a month. And later, when I became vice president and understood the economics of newspapering, I came to realize that that $5 may have covered the newsprint, probably not the ink, not the production costs, not the delivery costs, and certainly not the enormous costs of all the reporters and editors and photographers and skilled journalists putting that together. Publishers, and I was directly involved in this, publishers would limit circulation rate increases to optimize what we call units, which is copies, and market penetration to serve advertiser needs. So you would keep discounting circulation and make it a crazy good buy in order to be able to say you have 80 or 90% market penetration for your insert ads or other kinds of advertising. And I just think, I know journalism is more expensive to pay for these days, but I wanted to make that point that that's what's changed. The advertising is not there to support it, support the journalism like it once was. My next point, there's some bunch of former journalists, or current and former journalists in the room. Really great to see them, both from the State Journal and Cap Times. So I know what they'll think at this point. But I don't necessarily buy that old day journalism was remarkably better than today's, simply because there were more people doing it. Yeah, there were a lot more journalists in the State Journal and Capital Times building, but a lot of the positions that are not there anymore were not people doing frontline reporting. We had assistant photo editors, assistant city editors, assistant news editors, library staff, and you can say that, well, I see more typos or whatever, and those kind of safeguards are maybe not as prominent as they used to be. Editors of this era are really emphasizing and prioritizing frontline reporting to get feet on the street and to do good journalism. And so sometimes I think that's a little overstated. I was thinking about that as I wrote a column that's in print today about being in the Capitol during the era of Governor Earl, who we lost last week. And I was thinking about the press room, and the press room of that era had probably more than 30 of us in it. And it's half or a third of that now. And boy, didn't that yield just incredible journalism? Well, sometimes it did. Other times we work in kind of packs, and so there'd be 10 of us at the same gubernatorial press conference or covering the same floor session, and we would be producing 8, 9, 10 versions of a roughly similar story. AP, UPI, the Sentinel, the Journal were separate, the State Journal, Capital Times, Beloit, Green Bay had, or Janesville and Green Bay had people there. So I actually think that there's a lot of good work done today in trying to avoid that kind of duplication or that kind of paper of record stuff and looking at journalism a little differently. So I would just throw that out for your consideration. So my final couple points is that Madison is really lucky to have two sizable newsrooms, legacy newspapers that have excellent new leaders. And I just wanted to kind of throw that out there again, that I think it's really wonderful. My friends and former colleagues from Isthmus are also here today, and Isthmus is one of the finest alt-weeklies in the country. Its publisher Jason Joyce and editor Judy Davidoff are here. So we're pretty lucky in this town with our journalism. We're lucky that Madison's a great market, too. Madison, with its burgeoning tech sector, with the stability of UW and state government, and a well-educated readership, which is you, that really wants in-depth news and information, makes this a great place to do our jobs. I know for a fact that the Madison company here is performing at the very front end, at the top end of the Lee universe, which bodes well in terms of its financial performance. So what we need is community support from people like you for our subscriptions, our memberships, our events, as well as for you to consider our advertising and marketing capabilities when you have an opportunity to. My last point is that we're building a journalistic and business future on the size and quality of our audience, not on print circulation numbers. So with that, I appreciate your inviting me, and I'm happy if we have time to answer any questions.
Who's first?
I don't care.
Oh. Thank you, Paul, for being here. My question's about the future and the pipeline of journalists. What do you know about the number of students coming out of colleges and universities who will be tomorrow's journalists? Thank you.
Well, there's still plenty of them very interested in it. We're hiring. We've hired some exceptional young journalists coming into the profession. But it's a good question, Ron. I mean, it isn't a path that you get on and then can see a long-term future in necessarily. I think that we've had a lot of our young journalists get trained as develop the skills in our newsroom to go on to law school or other kinds of careers. But I think that I still think the pipeline is pretty strong. I think it's an intriguing job, and I feel pretty good about it. I haven't had a recent conversation with the university, but I think they're pretty pleased with the quality of candidate they're getting. We have a Marinus scholarship in which we have an internship for a Marinus scholar and have ended up hiring a couple of them. So that's not a real specific answer, but my impression is it's still pretty strong.
Hey, over here. This year, Tim Huang from MIT published a book called The Subprime Attention Crisis, which identifies and highlights a long-term trend of increase in ad blockers and decrease in click rates for online advertising. And while he's open that nobody can be sure how far that trend will go, if it continued during the current trend, the model of an advertising-based internet would stop being viable in some reasonable time frame. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that trend, and if it were to continue, presumably advertisers would not stop existing, but they would seek alternatives. What do you think the implications would be for newspapers?
It's a great question. I think, if I'm understanding correctly, I think the kind of advertising that, well, one thing is that we've been, didn't get into this, but newspapers have been massively hurt by Facebook and other platforms stealing our revenue, using our content to steal our revenue. I don't really know. I would imagine that would be an issue for us, that we'll have to move more toward a model in which readers value the information and will pay for a local news site just as they pay for a New York Times or Washington Post news site. I'm unclear on, at the Capital Times we think about trying to go to local advertisers that our readers would find as useful information as opposed to as distractions. And if that became an issue with being able to get that advertising presented with our content, I guess that would really rock us. But I haven't spent a lot more time on it, but that's my conceptual reaction.
Paul, thank you very much for joining us. As the cost of print has really skyrocketed, or at least home delivery of print has skyrocketed, it's interesting to me that I still have frustrations with my electronic versions of newspapers, and that there are big differences in the caliber of online presentation from, say, some of the national newspapers like Wall Street Journal or New York Times, which I also subscribe to, and compared to the local newspaper. And I'd be interested to know what Lee and or the local papers are doing to continue to improve the online user experience.
Yeah, since I'm on the Capital Times side of the building, I would say that Lee continues to try to improve the user experience, and they have the economy of scale because the user experience at Madison.com for the State Journal is going to be similar to the user experience in Buffalo or La Crosse or St. Louis. And there have been challenges there, and I think they're continuing to look at them. I don't know what else to tell you, Rick. I think it's an area of focus, and it is an area of concern, because as we move more toward digital, we need to really work on that customer experience.
Way back here, Paul.
Thanks for being here, Paul.
Sure.
Among the goals you listed for the Cap Times future was more, I forgot the phrase already, solutions-oriented coverage, I think was your phrase.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us what that means.
Well, it means to not only, I'd spent my whole career between the inverted pyramid type of story, which was the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the daily story in different forms, news features, profiles, investigative stories. Solutions-oriented journalism is about backing up and helping people understand how a local issue fits into the larger context of what's happened before, what the alternatives for action are, who the major players are, and then to present in the end some ideas about how things could go forward differently. Sort of trying to look for solutions. And we do that some on the editorial page, and we want to keep those separate. The editorial page is a bit more around those solutions, but we can also do it in news to tap in and say, so the achievement gap has been as big an issue as there's been in Madison for about 30, 40 years probably, and to continue to say, okay, bring the voices forward that have solutions, ideas for how to approach what seems to be almost an intractable problem, and try to put those out there. I guess that's the best I can give you.
This is a little more trivial, but first of all, thank you very much. That's a wonderful presentation. I've been going through kind of revisiting early scrapbooks, and I was surprised at the number of personal, just little anecdotes that I had clipped out. My question to you is, and I also had this discussion with another group of people who were involved in journalism, particularly for smaller towns, those little personal items were a real glue that held communities together. Is there a role for that in the newspapers of the future?
Yeah, I think there is. Beth had mentioned the idea of a print publication that has a lot of life events and that kind of news and information. The struggle is to organize and produce it and verify the accuracy of it in a process. I mean, it's all a balancing act, Regina. But I absolutely think it is. I mean, one of the important things in the State Journal forever was, for some reason we call them prep sports. I don't know. High school sports was always a major focal point of the State Journals, and continues to be. But that's a great area, and we'll have to figure out ways to truly reflect the community. The heart of the newspapers these days is, obviously you can find nation or world news a lot of places, and at the heart of the newspaper is how Kelly and Mark deploy their finite resources to cover what we think is the most important things to cover, and I do think there's room for that if we can figure out a way to bring more of it forward.
Hi, Paul. Could you please reflect on the respective roles of the newspapers today compared to the previous years and decades in terms of setting the agenda for the community, both editorially and through investigative reports?
Sure, Stu. I think we're still endeavoring to be what we always were in terms of agenda setting. I think that's one of the things we're talking about in the Cap Times. My dear friend Dave Zwiefel and John Nichols and I are talking about how do we get back to being more local. I mean, this is a little bit of inside baseball, but I think the Capital Times, being where it sits on the ideological spectrum, got so preoccupied with Donald Trump and national politics in the last few years. I think there's a great opportunity for us to get back closer to issues with the jail and with the achievement gap and with zoning and other sorts of things, and to go after more depth. I think, it always annoyed me a little bit when people would talk about the strength of the Washington Post and New York Times in terms of their investigations, and they'd have, one has more than 1,000, the other has 1,500 reporters or journalists, and we will be trying to do more in the investigative avenues going forward. I know Kelly is and will be too, and Mark as well. So identifying those areas, framing the issues, going after them, and then having an editorial response to it is important, has always been important, and I think it's going to be more important in the future because there's so much noise and clutter out there to be able to do that. Can we do better? Absolutely.
Thanks, Paul. Over here. My question is, can you speak to the challenges of the consolidation of the newspaper and frankly all media industries and how that translates for local coverage?
Yeah, I sure. When I was I'm just sort of a repeated line. When I was a young guy and in the newsroom, the newspaper, the Wisconsin State Journal, was entirely self-contained, and it had its own Nation World editor. It had roles like that, so that it would be produced entirely locally. The consolidation of corporate newspapering has put, and frankly, the advertising economic environment around advertising has put pressures on that. So what I'm speaking for Kelly here, but so there's a lot of the rest of the paper that is the same stuff can appear in St. Louis or Madison or Buffalo, but the heart of it is to retain the most number of feet on the street, the most number of independent, quality local journalists going out and finding stories that editors make decisions are most important to the community, and that's the best we can do. And I've watched this kind of evolution on the Lee side from a distance now for the last decade and a half, but I understand it, and I think that that's why having the largest number of reporters out there is so vital. I mean, Mark's only been here a couple of months, and we're having conversations about the Capitol and the university and local government, and what is our best? I call it a lane. What's our best lane for being most important to the community in terms of covering those areas and not backing away from those sorts of things? So it's prioritizing there. The consolidation of media, the companies, the hedge funds, and so forth is a reality, and we're in a transition period. And like I said, I'm not sure exactly where we'll come out. I have some ideas about what the models might look like after me, but it's just a guess at this point.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate that. You really continue on the excellence of programs that we've got here at the club, and appreciate your thoughtful comments and your leadership, and thank you for being a member, too. Appreciate that very much, Paul. And I wanted to say again, welcome to Tanya Zastro, for being a member. Appreciate that, and appreciate her sponsors, and welcome to all the guests. If you're interested in finding out more about membership, please let us know. And I hope that you'll join us next week when we have 4 speakers and a demonstration about dancing without limits and how wheelchair ballroom dancing empowers individuals. I think it's really going to be fascinating. So please enjoy the rest of your day. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you.